Hi. I thought it would be very beneficial for especially beginning players to get some helpful tips and some advice on how to become a more consistent Texas Hold'em player. Now, if you're just beginning to play Texas Hold'em, I'm going to do a quick run through of some terminology and how the game is played. So, first is to determine where the dealer is going to be. This is especially important in a home game, not particularly at the casino. And so you'll high card for who's going to be dealing first, and they'll have the dealer button right close to them, and they will deal out hands from a left to right. The person immediately to the left of the dealer has to put in what is called the small blind, and it's half of what the minimum bet is. So like if you start out at 1-2, they will have to put 1 out, and then to the left of them will be the big blind. So if it's 1-2, they will have to put 2 out, and this is to make sure that there's always a pot. And the person that is next to the big blind to the left is going to be the first one to act before the flop. And so just, we'll deal out the cards. Doesn't matter if it's head, up or down right now because I'm just going through it. So you have your cards pre-flop, and a round of betting occurs. So someone can just call the minimum, which is 2 at this point. They can raise, but they have to raise at least 2 more, so they have to at least raise it to 4, or they can raise more, depending on what type of game they are playing. And the most popular game is No Limit Hold'em, where you can bet all of your chips at any point in time. And so after this round of betting comes the flop. What you do is you burn a card, and then you take 3 cards and you put them face down onto the table. And the flop is the first 3 community cards. And community cards are cards that all players can use to make their best 5-card hand. And so then another round of betting occurs. Again, the minimum in this situation would be you got to bet 2, or you can bet more than 2, and people have to decide, or that you can check. So like post flop, the small blind would be acting first, and they can check, which means that they're passing their opportunity to bet. And there can be checks all around. There can be people that are going to bet. There can be people that can raise, and betting we'll get more into later. And so after this round of betting, you burn another card, and then you flip 1 more card. This is called the turn. Sometimes it's called 4th Street. And this is, again, these are all the cards out on the table that are not in your hand you can use to make your best 5-card hand. Then another round of betting occurs where people can check, bet, raise, whatever they desire. And after that round of betting, you burn 1 more card, and you put the last card down. It's called the River or 5th Street, depending on who you're speaking to. And then the last round of betting occurs, and then whoever's still in will show their hand, and whoever has the best 5-card combination wins the hand. And so in this sort of mock hand, there are 2 10s on the board, and so the person in position 4 has a Jack 10. They would have 3 10s, and that beats everyone else. And so they would take down whatever the pot is. So that's an extremely brief version of sort of the technique of how the game works in a sort of run-through format. But that's only part of the game, and another part of the game is to know what kind of opponents you can have. There are 4 main types of opponents you can have. One is a loose passive player. Their hand selection is really loose. They'll play even terrible cards, and their betting pattern is passive, which means that they'll pretty much call anything, and they don't really raise a lot. So they would fall under sort of the calling station persona, where no matter what you're betting, they're going to call you, pretty much. And these people are nicknamed fish just because they're willing to put chips in basically no matter what. There's also loose aggressive players. Their hand selection is really loose. They'll play extremely mediocre to bad cards, even if someone raises, say, pre-flop with pocket aces or whatever. And they usually will stay in until they don't have the chips to stay in. And these people are usually called maniacs because of their betting pattern and the hand selection that they play. Another type of player is more conservative. They are very tight in their hand selection and passive with their betting pattern, which means that they tend to stick to premium hands, such as hands that really win a lot, such as pocket aces, pocket kings, ace king suited sometimes is considered a premium hand. And they're passive in their betting pattern, as in they don't really raise a lot. They might bet like a minimum, and or they'll just call someone even though they have a big hand. And they are called rocks. And then you have tight aggressive players. Their hand selection is really tight. They tend to stick to premium hands. And they also tend to be extremely aggressive in their betting pattern. Someone might bet and they'll raise with their marquee hand. Or if no one has bet, they'll bet aggressively into the pot. And these personas are called sharks. So one thing I wanted to point out is that your hand selection and your betting and everything is sort of tied into position. What is your position at the table? So if we have 5 players like we do here and the dealer button is the first position, then the weakest position to be in pre-flop would be in the 4th position, which is the person to the left of the big blind, because you are basically determining what the rest of the table is going to do when you bet. And so if you just call the big blind, someone could be like, oh, they're weak, and can raise you and make you possibly fold your hand. So your hand selection there is going to be different than if you are on the dealer button, where you can play relatively looser. I wouldn't suggest playing like a 7-2 offsuit if you're in the dealer position. But if you have like a 10-9 suited or even an unsuited 10-9, then you can try and go with that hand more than if you were right next to the big blind. But the positions change after the flop. The small blind will be the first one to act, and they're in a tough position. And so you got to keep that in mind before the flop as well. And if you have the dealer button post-flop until the end, you are the last person to act. So you're in a really strong position throughout the whole hand. And so that gives you more flexibility as how you can play. So some players suggest that if you're the first one to act pre-flop, to raise it or fold it, which means that you should either raise the pot, whether that be a minimum raise or 3 times the minimum or whatever, or just give them back to the dealer and save yourself money, because the goal is to not leak chips, which means that little by little your chips are going to other people. And this is compared to, some players take the same philosophy when it comes to being on the button with the dealer button, is to either raise or fold. I don't subscribe to that for the most part. If you have a very mediocre hand, say a king 9 offsuit or something like that, it's a hand you would like to play because you can possibly get a straight with it. And if it's suited, you can possibly get a pretty good flush with it. However, if you raise and someone re-raises you, then you really have a tough decision as to whether you really want to play that hand or not. And so I would figure if you would just call and then someone raises, you can get out with minimum damage. But at the same time, if you play aggressively from the dealer button and everyone else has nothing that they want to play, you can take a pot. And so it really is individual preference in that position. Even if you're the first one to act, even though it's a general rule of thumb to raise or fold, you can still just call. And it really depends upon how your opponents are playing. Are they playing loose? Then you can probably just call and probably see a flop. If they're playing tight and aggressive, then you're probably not going to be able to do that all that often. So your position really determines hand selection, but at the same time you got to have some sort of strategy when it comes to hand selection, where at whatever position you are, you have an idea of what hand you want to be able to play and what hands you should just immediately throw away. And so, for example, if I'm the first one to act pre-flop, I subscribe to the philosophy of folding or raising, and usually playing premium hands such as pocket aces or ace king suited or any of the hands that are similar to that win a majority of the time against random hands. But even like if I am not the first one to act necessarily, if I'm next to the person that's first to act and I have a relatively mediocre hand, I still will dump it and give it back to the dealer, because then I'm technically the first one to act into the pot. But if you're on the dealer button, for me, that's when I loosen up a little bit, and I'll play connectors like 9-8 suited or unsuited, or 10-9 suited or unsuited, and see if maybe I can get a good flop and possibly win a pot. As it comes to how often to see flops, I subscribe to Chris Jesus Ferguson's advice on that, and you should probably see a flop 15 to 20% of the time. But that again depends upon how many players are at the table. So if you have 9 players, hand values tend to decrease, and so you probably will fold more. But if you're at a table where there's only 4 players or 5 players, then hand values tend to increase and you might play more pots. And so it's sort of an average, between 15 and 20% for each session. There are certain hands that I want to warn you away from. For example, I use King 9 for, if you're on the button. That's actually not, it's a decent hand, but it's not a great hand to raise with or to call a big raise with, because you've only got King 9. You're going to need 3 cards to make a straight, or a couple 9s, or a couple kings, and even if you get a couple kings, if someone has ace king, and it's odd that all the kings come out on the board, but it happens, you're in a dead-end situation, and you're going to probably either lose a lot of chips or fold in disgust. As it pertains to betting, that also depends upon position quite a bit. If you are the first to act, like I mentioned earlier, and you wanted to raise it, and it really depends on your hand. You're probably going to want to play a premium hand when you're the first one to act pre-flop. And so if you have like an ace-king suited, what do you really do in that situation? Well, in that situation, I would do what is called a standard bet. And so a standard bet here, say it's 1-2 small blind, big blind, you want to do probably about 3 times the big blind. So you would bet 6. But it varies. Some people will do a min raise where it's just 4, or some will do 4 times the big blind and it will be 8. And once again, it depends upon the players that you're playing against. If you have a feel that they're playing really tight, you can probably do a standard raise and maybe take down the pot. But if you have looser players, you want to make them pay. So you might go more than 3 times the big blind, which is standard. You might try 4 times. And then there are, especially if they're loose and passive, they'll pretty much call anything. So you probably, with the exception of all in, they're probably going to call you. And that's one of the things I also want to warn you against. Do not be in a hurry to go all in. One of my friends came up to play at my house, and he went all in on the first hand with pocket 7s. And it just so happened that I woke up with a hand pocket queens, and I just couldn't fold, and he was the first one out on the first hand. you want to try and stay in as long as possible so that you know the kinds of players that you're playing against, and if you know that, you can adjust your strategy accordingly, and you can possibly leave with more money than you came with. And also, when it comes to betting, there are ways to change gears, which means that you might start out as a tight passive player where you're playing premium hands and just calling people or min betting, and you can change gears and become, say, loose aggressive and play that way. They keep your opponents off balance, but you have to choose those spots very carefully because you can either win money in a hurry or you can lose all your money in a hurry when you sort of change gears. So you got to be able to pick your spots and have a good read on what your opponents are doing. And also you can disguise your hand strength if you are betting cleverly. So for example, if I have 10-9 of spades and there are 2 spades that come out on the flop, say an ace and 7 of spades with a 6 of diamonds, I have what is called a flush draw, so I can get one more spade on the board and give myself a flush. However, if I think my opponents are weak or that they will fold if I bet, I can put a bet out into the pot and sort of semi-bluff, in which I don't really have anything right now, but if a card hits and gives me what I need, then I will have probably the best hand. And also you can just plain bluff. You don't have anything, but your opponents are playing weak, and so you decide that if you bump it up, they're probably going to fold and you're going to get the pot, even though you've got squadouche. And this really disguises the way you're playing, but still at the same time, don't use that bluff too much, because if someone has a big hand, they're gonna make you pay for your bluffing, and it could cost you quite a bit of chips. So there are many ways to practice Texas Hold'em. One way is to actually take out a deck of cards and just start dealing them out, and you can do them face up, face down, with chips, without chips. You can have your friends over, you can play a cash game where the blinds stay the same, or you can have a sit and go or tournament type style where once you have no chips you're busted out. You can have rebuys. There's a lot of ways to play the game. And also you can, I don't recommend this when you're just starting out. You can go to casino and play. I mean, it's a relatively fair game because the house doesn't take a lot of money, and so you're basically just playing against the other players. And if you get really consistent with your strategy and being able to know when to change gears and when to back off, and all the other strategies that you might hear about or read about, then you could leave with more than what you had, and other times you could leave with just what you had in your pocket, or you can lose money. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily mean that you played poorly if that happens. The cards may have just went for it. If you cannot draw cards or you cannot get good whole cards to start out, it's just sort of the way that goes. Don't be discouraged. It happens to even the best poker players. And so just a couple of other thoughts. There are such things as bad beats, or suckouts is another term for it. I have to advise you that when this happens, it is wise to take a deep breath and count to 10 if you get upset. Because if you stay upset, you will go on tilt, which is a term meaning that you've lost your chips, you want to get them back, so you start playing recklessly. That's a quick exit if you stay that way. So please just take a deep breath and count to 10, get back onto the strategy that you want to have, and don't be discouraged. At the same time, there are situations where you're going to have to pick a hand and just sort of go with it. And so this situation, my general rule of thumb is if I only have 10 big blinds left, so say the blinds are 1, 2, and I only have 20, then it's about time for me to sit there and either fold or go all in if I'm playing no limit. And so it's just a matter of, is it the best hand you've seen in a while? What are the chances that the hand wins? And you sort of you pick that hand and you go with it, and if you lose, you lose. If you win, you double up and you're probably right back in it. And another thing to keep in mind when playing is it's a game, and it can be a really fun game. But you gotta be able to take bad beats, and you gotta be able to sort of loosen up and have fun. It's tough when it's real money, but you gotta have a good attitude when you go to the poker table. If you are going there with the exclusive goal of not losing any money, you're probably not gonna play as well as if you're looser and you have a good attitude of, I have confidence in my abilities, I know that I've practiced a lot, and I know my stuff, so that when things happen, I can change the way I play. And so when you sit down at a table, sort of try and have that sort of mindset and have that attitude, so that you will probably play a whole lot better and you'll have more fun. And my last sort of advice is to practice as much as humanly possible. And so I mentioned you can play with your friends, or just sort of deal cards while you're at home and you have not much else to do and you have music playing in the background or whatever. But there are also other ways to practice. You can go online. There are a lot of good free software programs. So like PokerStars.net is a good one. Full Tilt Poker is another. Party Poker is a good one. And if you have a consistent strategy on there, you will probably increase your play money quite a bit. And you cannot play for real money if you play in the United States because of the laws. But I don't care if it's real money or play money. The key is to go in there, have a good attitude, and try and get as much in the way of real money or play money as you can get. But at the same time, I caution you about online players, especially low buy-ins. They tend to play a lot of hands and a lot of mediocre hands to start out with, and at some point they're probably gonna outdraw you. They'll get a straight on the river when you had three of a kind or what have you, and like I said, when that happens, so just take a deep breath and chill out for a little bit, because that's not going to happen every time. It may seem like it sometimes, but that's just because of completely random variables. And there's no real explanation to it other than they just got the card that they needed. So these are like my key essentials. So always pay attention to what your position is. Are you close to the dealer? Are you not close to the dealer? Are you in the blinds? Hand selection is strongly linked to your position. If you're the first one to act pre-flop, it's suggested that you have a good starting hand before you either call or raise. And if not, if you have a very mediocre starting hand, then don't be afraid to fold it. Also, betting. You can use this in so many ways to confuse your opponents. If your betting is consistent, but the hands that you're betting with are not what they think you usually have. And also, if you have a draw, put a bet out there if you think there's a good chance to get it. So, like, if you have a flush draw and it's going to be ace high flush. If you make it, then put a bet out there. See if anyone likes their hand enough to call you. So I hope that these tips and advice help you with your experience playing Texas Hold'em. It's a wonderful game. It's very challenging and intellectual to a point, but they're also field players. So I think anyone can really play the game, and if you are consistent in your strategy, know your stuff, then you're probably going to make money, whether it's play money or real money. So I wish you well in your endeavors. Be well and take care.